Welcome to the Big Bass Podcast, the fishing show where size matters. I'm Ken Duke.
And I'm Terry Battisti. Our producer and engineer is the great Nathan Benson. For this episode of the Big Bass Podcast, we're going to take a deep dive into the Constitution state, Connecticut, and the man who has to rank as that state's greatest big bass angler of all time. And he's arguably New England's greatest big bass expert ever. So
I think so, Terry. Frank Domurat's track record of big Connecticut fish is not only unmatched, it might be unmatchable. He's one of only two anglers that we know of who simultaneously held the state record for both largemouth and smallmouth bass.
Yep. And he did it all fishing out of a homemade kayak and using just two lures. And I'll bet a couple of packs of Senkos that nobody has these lures in their box right now.
Pretty safe bet, I think. Well, let's talk about the guy first. His name was Francis B. Domurat, but of course everybody called him Frank. And Frank Domurat was born in 1912 somewhere in Connecticut. I hadn't been able to find it out. His parents were from Poland. His father was a barber. His mother worked at a hardware factory. In his 20s, Frank married a woman named Josephine. They had a son. He worked for a while as a bus driver, but soon after that, he became a barber, just like his father before him.
Yep. Yeah. And his Connecticut record bass, he actually had two of them. The smallmouth weighed 7 pounds, 10 ounces. It was caught September 24th, 1954, at a Lake Mashapog. And if I mispronounced that, someone let me know how to pronounce it. The lake is 287 acres inside and was just outside of Union, Connecticut. Domurat was, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, like Terry mentioned, he only used two lures. And ironically, he caught one of his state records on one of the lures and the other on the other lure. So this is pretty basic stuff, but we really want to get into his theories and attitudes about fishing in a bit here. Domurat, when he caught his state record smallmouth back in 1954, he was fishing a red and white Eppinger Daredevil spoon. It was late in the afternoon. He had caught a few small fish, and that's when he pulled his kayak into a small cove and started casting to some rocks. We got a great quote from him there.
Yeah.
Tell everybody, Tim.
He says, when I begin the retrieve, the spoon felt snagged, but then a lunker smallmouth jumped and identified himself.
I love those quotes that outdoor writers use that sound like no one could ever possibly have uttered that sentence. And that's one of those.
Yeah, exactly.
So, we know that fish weighed 710. We don't know much about the previous state record smallmouth in Connecticut, but there have been a number of fish reported weighing more than 6 pounds, going all the way back to the 1930s. And the biggest I could find before Domurat's 710 was a 1909 fish that weighed 612, caught from Old Killingly Reservoir, wherever that is. But that put Domurat on the board in 1954 as the record holder for smallmouth bass. Terry, he also had the state record largemouth.
Yeah, he did. And this fish he caught, 7 years later, at night. And the largemouth weighed 12 pounds, 14 ounces, which is a giant fish for New England. It's a giant fish pretty much anywhere you live.
Anywhere.
And where did he catch it, Ken?
Once again, Lake Mashapog. He fished that lake a lot. He knew it like the back of his hand. And what's not so surprising, what's surprising about that is not that the man caught giant bass out of a lake that he knew so well when his skills were so good and he was such a specialist, but it's that, you don't find many bodies of water in any state that produce record class largemouths and record class smallmouths. Usually they're caught in very different bodies of water, but he caught this state record largemouth only about 200 yards from where he took the state record smallmouth.
Yeah. He was fishing at night. It was June 5th, probably just the beginning of the night fishing season. Surface was calm, and Domurat was casting a bait that we've talked about quite a bit in the last, month and a half here on the Big Bass podcast. And he was fishing a jitterbug and casting to an area of lily pads. And again, he's quoted as the plug hit the water, I heard a tremendous crash as if someone had really fallen in along the shoreline.
Yeah, well,
Again,
that one sounds a little more plausible.
a little
Everybody
more
likes,
plausible, but still.
especially when you're fishing at night, and maybe you don't get to see the strike, you only hear it. So it sounds like a cement block drop from an airplane, or stuff like
Yeah.
that. But at 12:14, this was the largest bass that had ever been taken in the New England states, and it would remain the biggest bass out of the New England states for about 14 years until 1975, when Walter Balonis caught the Michigan state record through the ice in
Massachusetts.
February. I'm sorry, Massachusetts. What did I say?
Michigan.
Michigan.
Nope.
Massachusetts. Sorry, Walter Balonis, who's long past, but check out our show on Walter Balonis. It was one of the early shows we did. Check it out. We got a link for you right here. It's a good show about an amazing fish that a lot of people have their suspicions about, but quite honestly, those suspicions may be unwarranted. Now, ironically, when Dami Rat catches his 12:14 at a Mashapog in 1961 at night, his previous personal best had also been out of Lake Mashapog, and it weighed 9 pounds 2 ounces that he caught in 1953. Now, his 12:14 won that year's Field and Stream Fishing Contest Award for Northern Largemouth, and that's pretty prestigious. And they had some fairly difficult and solid standards for winning their contest back in the day.
Yeah. It required, photographs, required affidavits signed by two witnesses. There was, no just sending a picture in and claiming that you caught this fish. You actually had to have a pedigree with it. Thankfully, Field and Stream they were pretty dang strict about it, way more strict than any states were at the time. So,
length and girth, they wanted a photograph, they wanted a couple of witnesses. It was, if you could meet the Field and Stream standards, you were pretty easily going to meet any state standards at that time. Now, Dami Rat's 12:14 largemouth in 61, we don't have, or I couldn't find much information about a previous state record in Connecticut, but there are a few published reports that indicate that Dami Rat broke his own previous state record of largemouth bass at only 9 pounds 2 ounces. Now that's a massive gap between 9 pounds 2 ounces and 12:14. But there were some giants coming out of Connecticut, including fish over 12 pounds that were reported out of Moodus Reservoir in the 1950s. There was a 10-pounder out of some place called Black Pond near Meriden in 1960.
Also caught on a jitterbug.
Also on a jitterbug. And if you go way back to the 19th century, I found a report in the Meriden Weekly Republican. There was an article there. It said the record for biggest bass is still held by W.E. Rogers of Meriden, who last season captured a 6 3/4 pound fish.
And that was in 1897.
1897, one of the very earliest examples of any publication referring to a bass as a record of any kind. Nobody was thinking about record fish in the 19th century. But if Dami Rat broke his own state record, he broke it by 3 pounds 10 ounces. That's nearly 30% of the fish's body weight, which would be pretty dang remarkable. Now, Terry, what do we know about Lake Mashapog? I know we talked about it being, it's relatively small.
Yeah, it's another, small reservoir or, lake. It's 297 acres. It's a public lake surrounded by Bigelow Hollow State Park in the northeast section of Connecticut, close to the Massachusetts state line. Natural lake. And there are a couple of dams on the lake that help with water, regulation or depth. Maximum depth 15 feet, or excuse me, average depth 15 feet. Maximum depth is pushing 40 feet. and the name comes from two indigenous tribes language with massa and pug together mean large standing water. And at one time, Meshapog held the state records for largemouth bass, smallmouth bass, and brown trout all at the same time. So this lake is quite fertile when it comes to producing big fish.
Yeah, that's
I
very
wonder if it
impressive.
still is.
Yeah, I don't know. We've not found a lot of giant bass coming out of Mashapog, at least not reports of them. But let's get into Damirat's tackle a little bit, Terry. You're a tackle junkie.
Yeah, he
And
was.
Damirat really made it as simple as you could make it, basically.
Well, not only did he make it simple, I mean, you look at his approach. I mean, he was completely scientific. He wasn't buying store-bought rods. He was buying his own blanks and building custom rods. He didn't like small casting guides because he felt that they probably restricted your cast. So we
Oh,
put
how we have
spinning.
learned differently. But go ahead.
Well, I tend to disagree with that. But yeah, I mean, he was putting spinning guides on casting rods. You know, he was using a Silaflex 5C60F-2 spinning rod blank. So he's using a spinning rod blank, which are generally longer than casting rods, in order to build his rods. His reel was a pretty typical reel of the day in the 50s, a head and pal tournament casting reel. I've actually cast one of these things, and they are a dream. They're direct drive, but they are free spool. And they are a really, really cool little reel. And the tournament reel was the most expensive reel that you could buy from Hedden at the time.
And when you say direct drive, that means when if you turn the handle, one of two things happens. Either the object on the other end of the line comes to you, or the line breaks. There's no
Or
drag.
if it decides, if the line doesn't break, and it goes, and your hand slips off the handle, you end up with a bird nest that eagles are going to start scouting. Yeah, it's and then of course they're also called knuckle busters. You know, you want to get your hand
Yeah.
away from that turning handle, or you're going to break some fingers possibly.
What amazed me about Damirat's gear, Terry, is the line he fished. Ashaway was a very popular
Yeah.
braided nylon line back in the day, but
Hmm.
Damirat is using 4 or 8 pound test.
And if you remember from Lucas on bass, what pound test did he stress at this time? He was stressing, 6 pound, 8 pound, and even going down into that 4 pound class. So I wonder if Damirat was a student of Jason Lucas.
I think there's at least a decent chance.
Absolutely. I mean, you read his history and his thoughts on fishing, and he's really articulate.
Interesting you bring up Lucas. Jason Lucas, of course, one of the all-time great bass fishing writers. Lucas on bass,
And
a
bass
staple.
fisherman.
And bass fisherman, perhaps the greatest bass fisherman of his day. But think about it. Think about it this way: Damirat was a barber. What do you think the odds are he subscribed to Sports Afield and had it laying around the barber shop? I would say roughly
100%?
100%. 100%.
Absolutely. That
Didn't think
and
about that
probably
until this
Playboy,
moment.
right?
Well, of course. No. He's gonna have Sports Afield there. He might have Field and Stream there. Probably does have Field and Stream. He's winning Field and Stream contests. He's gonna have
Yep.
outdoor magazines there.
Damn right.
Might even had Outdoor Life, but using that super light line gave him the opportunity to cast further, and he had a great quote about it. He said, "The lighter the line, the greater the sport. Using this light tackle, I have taken many bass over 5 pounds, and I've also lost many good fish."
Yeah.
You win some, you lose some.
He was, to me, it sounds like he's an articulate, honest angler. I mean, he's not gonna boast about his big fish, but he's also not gonna say he gets them all in. He's gonna
There you
lose
go.
some. So,
Now,
but what about the
mentioned-
lure?
Yeah, the lures. We already mentioned he only threw two lures, and of course he caught the record largemouth on an Arbogast jitterbug. But
Hmm.
where we spent an episode not long ago talking about what we think is the all-time greatest big bass bait, the jitterbug, we focused mostly on the musky jitterbug in that
Yeah.
episode, and soon we're going to be having an episode coming up where we're going to bring in Jimmy Zinker, who is the best jitterbug modifier out there, and he's going
And
to teach.
probably the best jitterbug angler currently. I
Hard to
mean,
argue with that too. So we'll
yeah.
have Jimmy on to talk about that very soon. But but Dami Rat was using a more modest size bait. He favored the 1/4 and 3/8 ounce jitterbug, and he only threw two colors, Terry.
Yeah.
If it was after dark, he threw black, and if it was
Yep.
dawn or dusk, he threw perch.
Hmm.
And he
Yeah.
favored a. Whereas a lot of guys, especially at night, like that steady, nonstop retrieve the bass can kind of home in on. Dami Rat believed in a slow retrieve with a lot of pauses.
Which is totally contradictory to what we, what Brasher did, what Zinker's doing, all that stuff. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
And
And he only threw it when the water was calm. And this is where the the other lure will come into play if it's a if the surface isn't slick.
yeah, and
So
let's get into that because we've talked a lot about the jitterbug. And we hope folks will go back and check out that episode where we talk about the history of the jitterbug and Fred
yeah.
Arbogast and stuff. Let's dig into the Eppinger Daredevil spoon.
Hmm. Yeah. So he preferred a 1/4 or 2/5 ounce. You don't see weights like that anymore. 2/5 or 4/5, which they were weighted like that way back when. They were probably being truthful, whereas now today they just probably say, "Oh, this is 3/4 of an ounce." But anyway, so he preferred the 1/4 and 2/5 ounce in red and white under low light conditions or at night, and he would fish the jitterbug again if it was calm. But if there was wind, that's when he would put the Daredevil spoon on. And he would cast the spoon out near heavy cover, usually brush or rock, and start a medium retrieve as soon as it hit the surface. And, pretty much the same way a Daredevil's probably been fished for 100 years.
Yeah, I think the casting spoon, which is what I would classify the Daredevil spoon as, a casting spoon. It's not a weedless spoon. It's not a jigging spoon. It's
No.
a heat it
Although
out there, wind
they
it
did
back.
make a weedless one.
Sure, but that's not what we're talking about here. That's not what
No.
Dami Rat used.
Uh-uh.
This is a chunk it out, wind it back. It twists, it spins, it twists your line up. It imitates a bait fish, flashes. Fish eat it. Fish of all kinds eat it. I mean, this is not a bait
Hmm.
that was designed specifically for bass. This is an everything bait. And Terry, I know you know the history of just about every bait on the market. Do you want to get into that a little bit?
Uh, yeah, I guess I thought Eppinger was from Wisconsin,
He was
but
born.
born
Well,
in
he was in
Michigan.
Michigan. Born. Well, I think he was born in Wisconsin, and he worked in Michigan as a taxidermist.
Oh, okay, and then he went back to Wisconsin at some point because I know where that's where the factory is now, I believe, or is it in Michigan?
I will
I
do a
can't
real time fact check on that,
do
Terry
that.
Battisti, because that's what we do on the Big Bass podcast. We do real time fact checks. This is not your run of the mill CNN or Fox News where they just say anything. We're real news here. This is not fake news. But as far as Eppinger goes, kind of a legendary bait designer, and
Hmm.
he was born in Detroit, and and I guess began as kind of a Michigan taxidermist, and then maybe for whatever reason, he got the spoon company going and spent a lot of time in Wisconsin. I really not sure about that, but I can say he was born in Detroit.
Okay. Anyway, uh, so he starts, making the spoon, and originally he calls it an osprey. And then in 1918, he changed the name to Daredevil to honor the Marines who fought in World War I, who were known as the Daredevils. He changed the spelling of devil from Devil to uh, Devle because he was getting a lot of pushback from the clergy in the area, and so he ended up changing the name of the way it was spelled. And during World War II, he was manufacturing the spoons with caricature likenesses of Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini and Hirohito stamped into them to mock the Axis leaders.
I think
So
that's
he
hilarious.
had
I
a good
understand
sense of
those
humor.
things are worth 50 or 60 bucks nowadays. They made
Yeah,
hundreds of thousands of them, but that's pretty interesting. And of course, we
yeah,
mentioned he fished out of a 28-pound homemade kayak. We've got a picture of
yeah.
that.
Darn
Um,
right.
yeah,
Yep.
just a 28-pound kayak that he could easily manipulate, throw on top of his car, I'm sure, because we don't think he lived on Lake Mashapog. Um, he he would travel to it and probably launch his kayak, and at 297 acres, you could hit the whole thing. So,
Yeah,
but I wanted to go in to a little bit of his angling philosophy and his
yeah.
tips for catching big fish, because I think they have value for us today.
Oh,
Um,
absolutely.
he thought there were four keys to catching good fish.
Hmm.
He fished mostly at night and mostly alone. He
Yep.
said your concentration is greater, and that makes a big difference. He said learn to leave your problems at home or at work. Enjoy
Hmm.
the outdoors and concentrate on fishing only. And he believed that night fishing was best for larger bass.
Huh.
Uh, and we
Yep.
we talked a little bit about how well he must have known Lake Mashapog. He focused on one body of water, and he knew that he had a big bass producer in Mashapog. Fished from that kayak, it got him really close to where he needed to be, and he didn't want to disturb the fish. And he said almost all of his fish over 5 pounds had been taken from less than 5 feet of water, so being quiet was a big deal to him. He used
Right.
only 2 lures and said you don't need a great number of lures to be successful, just a few lures that you knew how to work correctly. And he
Hmm.
also thought that anglers wasted too much time changing lures when they're probably just fishing in the wrong place. Hard to argue with that.
Yep. Yep. All right. I just found it. Eppinger, you're right, Ken, as usual.
It happens
Det-
occasionally.
the Detroit, Michigan. It threw me for a loop because Dave Smith or Stump Jack just did a really nice article on Bass Fishing Archive's website on Eppinger. And him living in Wisconsin, I thought he actually went to the Eppinger plant and sat with Karen Eppinger. And evidently, I'm confusing that with someone else that he wrote about. So
No, you,
I'm
you just
sorry to
keep
doubt you.
you just keep on
Sorry to
doubting
doubt
me.
you.
You just keep on doubting me. We'll see how that works for you. Uh,
Oh man.
uh, Tommy Red also thought there were 5 tips that he shared in a Bassmaster magazine article for taking big fish. The first thing he said was that patience is a must. Even when the fishing's slow, don't get discouraged. Take a little break, analyze your situation before you go back, and it'll kind of refresh you. He thought concentration was critical. He believed in fishing at night, as we mentioned, and he thought that he could always find fish in the quiet coves around the heaviest cover. And he wanted to be really super duper quiet. He thought those quiet coves with the heaviest cover were the key to New England big bass fishing. Um, he believed in setting the drag on his reels properly and making sure the line's not frayed and the needles are sharp. Um, he he didn't strike at the sight of a fish hitting that jitterbug. He waited until he could feel the fish. And of
Yeah.
course, like everybody does, he wants to keep a tight line. Um, and he said, don't try to land a big bass before it's ready.
And all of those things Jason Lucas wrote about,
There you
especially
go.
the concentration and keeping quiet. You know.
Domby Rat had to have Sports Afield magazine and Jason Lucas's work
Yeah.
sitting in the waiting area of his barber shop. My
One
God.
of one of Lucas's famous quotes that came from Stan Fagerstrom, and this was in a letter from Jason to Stan that I read, and it said he was getting ready to go out to Washington to fish the Pacific Northwest. And he said, "Oh, by the way, I should let you know that I don't fish with anybody for fear the the person might try to talk to me.
Oh
I
my
need to
gosh.
be concentrating on fishing instead of being out there talking."
Yeah, for folks who aren't familiar with Jason Lucas, he was the editor of fishing editor of Sports Afield magazine from 1948 to 1968.
Yeah,
I think he was the greatest editor, fishing editor of any of the big three magazines in history. He was succeeded by Homer Circle in '68. He wrote the seminal book of the late '40s, '50s, early '60s called Lucas on Bass, and he was so critical because he was the first guy to become fishing editor of one of the big three outdoor magazines who was a bass guy.
yep.
Everybody before him had been a trout guy, the Ted Truebloods of the world and so forth. They'd all been trout guys. The Ray Bergmans had been trout guys. Some of them written about bass, but Lucas was a hardcore bass guy. And in his day, 40s, 50s, into the 60s, he may have been America's best bass angler.
Yeah, fished 365 days a year and pumped out a column or 2 or 3 articles in field or Sports Afield every issue. I mean,
Yeah,
he was prolific.
but we're talking about Frank Domurat.
Yeah, we are.
And Frank's simultaneous, I got off on the Lucas digression there, but Domurat's simultaneous Connecticut state records for largemouth and smallmouth. Well, great things seldom last. And in 1980, Domurat's record smallmouth bass was broken by a fish that weighed 2 ounces more. So it weighed 712. There are a lot of folks who want to challenge Domurat's records. And like most cowards, they show up in the comments section of websites and stuff. And they say, oh, he didn't correctly fill out his affidavit. But they never produce a copy of an affidavit to establish that. They say his record application is missing important information, but they never say what that information is. What are you looking for here? Moon phase? You're looking for shoe size? What do you want? He satisfied the field and stream standards, and those are the highest standards of the day.
Yeah.
People want to see evidence. They want to see a photo, length measurements, stuff like that. Most of that stuff is available. It's out there. They're just too dumb or lazy to find it. I also want to point out that the record standards were different then. And Domurat not only met the Connecticut standards, but he met the field and stream fishing contest standards, which were almost certainly the most demanding of that era. So he met every standard. Get off his back. He still has the largemouth record in Connecticut, and perhaps will for a long time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's what, 52 years old. That's
it's older than me, 62 years old. Hey, we've been holding back, Terry Battisti. Tell everybody we've been holding back.
Well, yeah, I mean, not only did he own the smallmouth bass record and the largemouth bass record for the state of Connecticut, but he also held the state record for northern pike. I mean, this guy was just a great big fish angler. He caught the fish in the Connecticut River in 1960, and between his 2 record catches, it weighed 16 pounds, 11 ounces. And then that record was eclipsed in 1974. So he had it for more than a decade. And for that decade or a little bit more, he had 3 of the most coveted fishing records in that state. How can anybody compete with that?
Who's gonna ever do that?
I don't know.
Not ever again. And Frank Domurat died on June 6th, 1995 in Pensacola, Florida. He was 82. And hey, more than just an angler, Frank Domurat was also, and I like to dig up some information on these people and find out a little bit about who they were. He was also a son, a husband, a father, a civic leader, an entrepreneur, a banjo player, and an expert glider pilot and avid coin collection. Terry, do you know how I know he was an expert glider pilot?
No.
Because he wasn't smashed on a rock somewhere. If if you die at 82 of natural causes and you were ever a glider pilot, you're an expert glider pilot in my eyes. Because you're either an expert or staying on a rock. Those are the only two categories of pilot. So that's our show about the man who is certainly the greatest big bass specialist in Connecticut history, and arguably the greatest trophy bass angler in the history of all New England. Dr. Terry Battisti, takeaways on Frank Domurat.
I think the records are legitimate based upon the fact that he won those field and stream, contests. Like you said, I mean, it was the strictest record keeping institution at the time. There's no way in my eyes that you can dispute that. So my takeaway is that Domurat is probably the best big fish angler in New England, or at least in Connecticut, and he deserves to not have his name sullied in the websites of the world now. Ken?
I'm right there with you, man. I think that, for anybody who wants to take a shot at the late, great Frank Domurat, get yourself a jitterbug, get yourself a daredevil, get yourself a 28-pound homemade kayak, and break his damn records.
Yeah.
Till then, back off.
Exactly.
Take us home, Doctor.
Well, it's time to slam the door on this episode of the Big Bass Podcast. Thank you all for joining us tonight. We know your time is important, precious, and we really appreciate your support. If you enjoyed the show, please hit the like and subscribe buttons. And if you could do us a favor, please recommend the show to a friend, just one. If we do that, we double our subscribers really quick. If you're a Big Bass junkie, check out the website at thebigbasspodcast.com. You'll find the Big Bass Podcast calculator, good for fish over 14.5 pounds, i.e. largemouth, not smallmouth, unless you're from Florida, Ken.
Ultra hard.
And we have listed state record largemouth, smallmouth, and spotted bass. If you'd like to contact us, you can reach us via email at ken@thebigbasspodcast.com. Excuse me, Terry@thebigbasspodcast.com, and Nathan@thebigbasspodcast.com. Please join us again soon. We'll be bringing you another story about another big fish that you cannot and will not find anywhere else. And remember,
size matters.